Take it away, Dr. Mueller.
All right, sounds good. Well, thanks for the introduction, Kyle, and just interrupt me if at any time you can't hear me or something. So, um, yeah, but it's really great to visit you all virtually, and I just wish that I could be there in person, but my busy teaching semester, so this virtual option worked out pretty well. So. Yeah, as Kyle said, I'm going to talk about adapting agriculture to climate risks, and explore some of our different work in this area. So I thought I would start out with this global map, since I'm speaking to a geography and spatial science department. It seemed appropriate to start with a pretty global map. But also because I think it does a really nice job of kind of showing the extent to which agriculture has a massive impact on the planet. Um, and conversely from that, the extent to which any changes we make to our planet, like climate change, have the potential to impact agriculture. Um, so this map is showing the world's agricultural systems, both cropland and rangelands and pastures. So the croplands are more in green, the rangelands and pastures are more in brown. Um, and kind of those intermediate shaded cells, some mix of the two. And the our food systems are really profoundly connected with the global environment. So as you can see here, for just the sheer spatial extent, we're using close to 40% of the Earth's surface for agriculture, all sorts of impacts on air, water, and biodiversity. If we think more about the connections between food systems and climate, about a quarter of our global greenhouse gas emissions are from agriculture and land use change directly. But if we zoom out a little bit to the broader food systems, not just what's happening directly on the land management, but also processing and transportation and waste and so on, we get something like more like a third of global greenhouse gas emissions from the food system. So it's a really important impact on climate. And of course, our food production is at risk in a changing climate. And that's what we're going to focus more on in this talk. But near the end, I want to bring it back to this kind of mitigation perspective to think about the connections between adaptation and mitigation. All right. So when it comes to knowing what the impacts of climate change on agriculture are going to be, there's been a ton of relevant research out there, and I just throw up this graph here. This is not a paper that I was involved in, but I think it did a nice job of showing some of the different approaches that are out there, from gridded simulation models, point level simulation models, different sort of statistical models, and you can see how they agree or don't agree in some cases on the temperature impact on crop yield, the percent change per degree Celsius. But overall, there's some decent agreement here, at least in these areas that were simulated in this paper. But even with all of this progress and all of these different methodological approaches out there, a lot of these studies have some very important limitations. They do things like assuming that the crop area distribution stays the same in the future, that what specific cultivars farmers plant don't change, that when farmers plant and harvest won't change, and that the agronomic practices that farmers use also stay the same. Now, this is not a like a too heavy of a critique. Obviously, the place where we need to start with this literature is to hold everything else constant and then look at the impacts of climate change. But it is going to really limit our ability to see what's coming down the pipe, because if we know anything about agriculture, it's that it's always changing, right? There's always new cultivars, different changes in management. And so we need to understand how those changes might allow us to adapt to climate change and to what extent that's possible. So this this emerging field of climate risk and adaptation requires a lot of different perspectives, things like, social science to understand um, uh, perceptions and actions, um, different scenario analyses of the future, but also looking retrospectively to try and better understand what people are already doing to see how that might inform the future. And that's kind of a perspective that I'll take more in this talk. For some of you, this graph may be super familiar, and to others, it may be somewhat new, but I'll just walk you through it. This is the kind of the IPCC perspective on climate risk, where the risk of a negative outcome is the intersection of the biophysical climate hazard, exposure to that hazard, and the vulnerability to that hazard. So I like to think of it in terms of a heat wave and human health. So the heat wave is the hazard. Exposure is whether you live in the path of the heat wave or live, 1,000 miles away. Um, and your vulnerability has to do with things like, okay, do you have air conditioning in your home? Do you work an office job? Or are you doing physical labor outside? So you could imagine, you know, um, all of those pieces, that the hazard, the exposure, and the vulnerability need to come together to create that risk of a negative impact. But that also means that there are mechanisms for adaptation too, right? And we know that climate variability and change is altering those physical climate hazards, but we do have some control as humans over exposure and vulnerability. So I think a lot of the times when we think about adaptation actions, we are thinking about actions that reduce vulnerability. So on the crop side of things like shifting cultivars, maybe to something that's more heat or drought tolerant, livestock management, using housing or shading, something like that, where that hazard might still exist and you're still exposed to the hazard, but maybe now you are less sensitive to that. But another thing we can do is reduce exposure. And this can manifest in a couple of different ways. We can think about it kind of from a spatial dimension. So as farmers change what crops or livestock they're producing, that can manifest in kind of the large scale migration of agricultural systems across the landscape. Or we could think about it from a temporal perspective. So the seasonality of different production systems could affect the exposure. And then lastly, this is maybe a little bit more out of the box, but I think we also see that there are some actions that we can take within agricultural systems that serve to reduce hazards. So usually we think about the hazards just being influenced by weather variability or climate change. But there are things that we do on farms that modify weather conditions. So one kind of the canonical example might be irrigation. So when we have more irrigation, we tend to not only do you increase the soil moisture, you also have more productive vegetation, and you can get irrigation-induced cooling, not just in the canopy, but even in the surrounding areas. Also, things like residue management can alter albedo, and that can change uh, weather in subtle ways, as well as something as simple as windbreaks. So could help prevent blowdowns. So these are all things that are kind of separate from mitigating greenhouse gases, but they still reduce hazards on farms. So I want to just dive into a few different examples of how we've tried to characterize climate hazards, and then I'll talk a little bit more about adaptation. So I'm going to start with rain-fed crops in the US, then we'll move to irrigated crops globally, return to the US to talk a little bit about dairy systems, and then wildfire. So first, let's focus on US rain-fed crops. There are kind of two main approaches that are commonly used out there to look at the impacts of weather variability and climate change on crop productivity, either using process-based crop models or statistical models. Um, and both of these approaches have their limitations. They both have strengths and limitations. Um, limitation of the process-based models is that they're often pretty complex and highly parameterized, and so it's hard to know how to generalize them across space or time. In statistical models, they do better with that generalizability. You're capturing the average effect, but across space and time. But the predictors that are used are often pretty simplistic and neglect the impact of too much water on crop yields. So what we did here was we adopted a framework to consider both water supply and water demand on rain-fed crop productivity. Um, and just to illustrate why that's important, these are just a couple of graphs showing cause of loss records by hazard for the US. These are coming from the USDA Risk Management Agency, and there's another source for the Chinese data. But I just want to highlight how similar these look in both cases, very different contexts, but in both cases, most of the crop losses that are being recorded are either coming from too little water in the red or too much water in the blue. All right, so this is our very simple framework here, kind of our mental model of what we expected this pattern might look like. So as we might expect optimal conditions for crop yield to be somewhere in the middle of a decent amount of soil water supply, but not too much, not too little, and atmospheric evaporative demand, again, not too much, not too little. Um, and we would expect the most negative conditions to be kind of up here where you have a low soil water supply and high atmospheric demand, very droughty conditions, or to have real waterlogging conditions down here in the bottom right. So what we did is we put together a statistical model where we used PRISM weather data, USDA historical crop yields from the 80s. And we created this exposure-based regression model over this time period. We also used a soil moisture reanalysis product that was put together for the National Climate Assessment. And then we can attribute historical rain-fed crop losses to these different hazards. So first, just showing what it looks like when we go from our kind of mental model to the actual statistical model results. The shading here, the darker it is, the darker red, the more negative the responses to those conditions, and that's all relative to this optimal bin. So basically, what these units are showing is for every 1% of the growing season that you spend in a given set of conditions, you're expected to lose that much yield in terms of kilograms per hectare relative to if that 1% of the growing season was in that optimal set of conditions. So what we can see is that, yeah, it followed our expected pattern pretty well. We really capture in the historical record, we can see really clearly the effects of those droughty conditions and the waterlogging conditions. And then we can actually attribute historical crop yield losses to those different conditions over time relative to a counterfactual where there were no hazards. And you can see how much of the crop losses in any given year are actually coming from those different conditions. And so something that I think is really interesting as somebody who grew up in the Midwest, seeing a lot of cornfields as a kid, you in a lot of years actually waterlogging losses are pretty comparable to the drought losses. And then you get these really severe drought years like 2012, 1983, and I think in 1988, where the drought losses were just really dominant and profound. But then in a lot of these wetter years, the waterlogging losses are just as important, if not more important in some years. All right, so let's move on from rain-fed crops to think a little bit more about irrigated crops. So as I mentioned earlier, when we were talking about climate risk and reducing hazards, there are a lot of benefits of irrigation. So not only are you supplying water to the crops, but you're also helping alleviate heat stress that the within the crop canopy. Um, so we see the highest productivity places in the world are almost always irrigated places. Um, and so, and I should mention, irrigation is really, irrigated areas produce a disproportionate amount of the world's calories relative to their area because they are so productive. Um, so irrigation basically is very important for productivity, but we do worry about the sustainability of water supplies for irrigation. And in particular, I want to focus on surface water supplies and the importance of snowpack in providing water for those crops. Um, so what we wanted to know here was really just how dependent is irrigated agriculture on snowmelt, and then what are the risks going forward in the future from changes to that snowpack? Because snowpack is really providing a great ecosystem service for agriculture by essentially being this giant reservoir of water that lasts farther into the growing season. So first we had to ask, where is irrigated agriculture dependent on snowmelt? And for that, we used this map from our co-author, Stefan Siebert, who exhaustively compiled statistical records of one form or another across the world to basically map out the dependence on groundwater versus surface water. And then we have to ask how much water is consumed by crop evapotranspiration. And so here we also used the Siebert et al. Product, and then we modified it over time to account for changes in irrigated area. And so you can see the simulated increases in water consumption over that time. All right. So that's on the consumption side, and then we need to look at the runoff side of things. So we also ask how much runoff originates as snow, and to do that, we use the TerraClimate model, and we actually added some new calculations to partition runoff between rainfall and snowmelt. And did a bunch of validation of that as well. And what we can see here is the snowmelt runoff ratio. So how much runoff in a given year comes from snowmelt. And it looks kind of as you would expect. It's really dominated by high elevations and high latitudes. And if we look at the projected changes in that snowmelt runoff ratio into the future, we can see that there are some concerning trends where you get pretty steady decreases in that snowmelt runoff ratio with warming. And so the question here is, where will changes in snowmelt align with crop water consumption, and can irrigated agriculture stay viable? So to do that, what we do is we have to look at the seasonal patterns of the water consumption and the water supply. And this is a nice example from the San Joaquin Basin in California. It's a nice example because it basically doesn't rain the entire summer. So it's really clear the benefit that snowmelt is providing by extending runoff into the growing season. So here in the solid lines, you can see the rainfall runoff and the snowmelt runoff in the historical period, and then how those are projected to change in the future. And so basically we see more rainfall runoff when we don't want it, and less snowmelt runoff during that early part of the growing season when we can really use that runoff. Now, if we look at the late part of the growing season, this is surface water consumption that is being met. It's just not being met by the runoff that is happening in those months, right? So it is being met through a combination of reservoir storage of the runoff earlier, and interbasin transfers like the State Water Project in California. Um, and so what we're worried about are these places where basically the gray bars where you need these alternatives like the reservoir storage and the interbasin transfers to meet demand. We're concerned about basins where the gray is growing and the blue is decreasing. And we can map out those places across the world. And what we see is that uh, the Western US really pops out. Parts of Southern Europe and Central Asia are kind of these snowmelt risk hotspots for irrigated agriculture. And then in some subsequent studies, we looked at how these risks extend geographically due to global trade. So something in the order of 16% of all snowmelt dependent crop production does end up being exported. And so you have places like Northern Europe where they don't have any snowmelt dependent production, but their consumption is actually still decently dependent on snowmelt. And we've also looked historically to show that some of these basins at risk are already seeing changes during the past several decades. Now I want to talk a little bit about move away from crops and talk a little bit about animal agriculture. Usually we often hear about animal agriculture in the context of climate change mitigation, and that's a very important topic. But we maybe hear a little bit less about how animal ag systems can also be at risk from changes in climate. And so I got interested in this topic and thought it could be a really nice extension of some of the tools that we've used to look at crops, to bring those to look at dairy systems. And what I found when I started digging into this is that the animal level responses to thermal stress are pretty well characterized in the animal science literature. There have been a lot of studies on this, but the system level responses were unknown. So sometimes people would take these models of individual cows and project them out into the future, but that just kind of assumes a cow in a field with, like in isolation of management or things like that. So what we wanted to really understand is just how sensitive the system is in the context of management, because there are these environmental control practices like housing, shading, fans, and misters that people use to basically protect the cows from weather variability. So the context here is that milk production is really concentrated in California, the upper Midwest, and the Northeast. And just like crops, we see strong technology trends in yields, but there is a lot of variability still within that, and we don't understand, how much of that variability is coming from weather. All right. So to do that, what we did a model, we created a model that was actually fairly similar to what I showed earlier for rain-fed crops, but in this case, we just have one explanatory variable, and that is this THI, this temperature and humidity index, which is kind of like a heat index for cows. And then we use historical milk yield data. Fortunately for us, we have monthly data. Unfortunately for us, they're at the state level. So then we also use county level data to look at the weather conditions that those cows were exposed to. So we use the county cow population data to basically translate the locations of the cows to get the appropriate weather data. And what we see here is that both the heat stress and the cold stress response emerge pretty strongly in the historical data. What was sort of surprising to me is that I anecdotally, I just thought that heat stress would be more important than cold stress, but actually it turns out cows use a lot of energy to stay warm, and that can reduce their milk yield. So we saw that cold stress was also an important driver of reduced loss of decreased yields in the historical period. Um, and then in some subsequent work, we also looked at some different heat indices to see, how stable this response was, and we found it was um, pretty well represented despite which index we used. Here's the THI, adjusted THI, CCI, BGHI. I don't need to go into all these acronyms, but just know that that's relatively consistent result. But often something that we see in the literature is the use of just simple thresholds of these indices. And we found that it was a much more continuous response over this whole range. Um, so our next steps with this is that we are trying to use machine learning to create a thermal stress index and understand uh, kind of the different, sometimes when you use these indices, it's hard to tease apart the influences of different components. So we're trying to use kind of an explainable machine learning approach to understand how different weather conditions affect stress. And we have partnered with the Dairy Records Management Services, and we have 155 million geolocated lactation records that we're building this model from. All right. So moving on from dairy, I want to just also take a pause from showing quantitative results and talk about a study that we did that was more about thinking about reviewing the literature and thinking about a framework for thinking about a climate hazard, and that's wildfire. So this is uh, a picture of Estes Park, just up the road from us in Fort Collins. Maybe you've visited Rocky Mountain National Park and have been there. And this was back in 2020 when we had two of the, the two largest wildfires in Colorado history almost combined and almost burned down the town of Estes Park. So the East Troublesome Fire kind of jumped the Continental Divide in the national park. And if you've ever been up there, it's basically just tundra. There's like almost nothing to burn. Um, but uh, the town had to be evacuated. This is in the middle of the day, the traffic jam trying to get out of town. And I remember sitting on a Zoom call for some, I don't know, administrative thing this day when it was just orange outside and thinking, hey, why am I on this stupid Zoom call? And B, I wonder if this matters for the systems that I study. How is agriculture affected by these really catastrophic wildfires? So I had a really amazing undergrad join the group around then, and we did this literature review and came up with this pathway study where we looked at all of the different ways that wildfire can affect agriculture and kind of identified three main pathways. So um, of course, you can have direct fire losses to crops or livestock. Um, but more common are impacts downwind. So you have increased particulate matter, and that changes the radiative environment for crops. So often close to the fires, you can see reductions in radiation and decreases in crop yields, but actually farther away, you can have more diffuse fire and actually see increases. But fire also elevates ozone, which is damaging to crops, and we can also see impacts downstream due to changes in runoff patterns and also sedimentation that can damage reservoirs and irrigation equipment, things like that. All right, so those are some different climate hazards. And now I want to talk a little bit about evidence for adaptation, looking at some of these different systems. And so specifically looking at the past to try and understand what might happen in the future. So if we go back to that dairy example, something that we found in that study that was really interesting was that there were differences in the sensitivity of yields to THI depending on the average climate and over time. So basically we found, for example, that cold states are much less sensitive to cold than hot states, and vice versa for heat. And then over time, we see that yields were a lot more sensitive in the past to both heat and cold than they are in the more recent decades. And so we extended our model to actually account for some of these interactions with average climate and with time. And we can actually tease apart, state-specific response functions. And so here's an example for California where you can see that now in the most recent decade, if you look at these uncertainty bounds, it's almost insensitive to weather. But in the past, what we saw was pretty high sensitivity, especially to cold stress in California. And so what we think is going on here are a lot of changes in management, a lot of consolidation that's happened over this time period, more intensive systems with more housing and more shading structures and so on and so forth. And we have a grant working with mostly the University of Vermont, but also colleagues at USDA to kind of dig into that and show that a little bit more. So that's thinking about vulnerability. Let's think about exposure now. So again, a common assumption when we try and project what's going to happen to crops out in 2050 or 2080 is that we just assume crops stay the same in the same places. But we have some colleagues at the University of Minnesota that have kind of compiled a lot of historical agricultural census data. And that allows us to look at changes in area over time. And so here we're looking at changes in rain-fed harvested area for maize. And we can see that some places have increases in rain-fed maize harvested areas, other places have decreases. And the question here is this crop migration adaptive? So, and we said, okay, it's adaptive if it avoids extreme growing season temperatures, just to keep it simple. So we use quantile regression to look at the average growing season temperatures for all of the rain-fed maize areas. And then we look at how basically the upper bound of that would have changed in the absence of crops moving across the landscape and with crops moving across the landscape. So basically this gray line shows the trend that we would have seen if crops had stayed fixed in their, circa 1970s locations. And then the red line shows what was actually experienced. So basically for maize, we saw that warming trend and that upper bound of growing season temperatures was reduced by, I think, around 40%. And so that's not to say that it's necessarily doesn't mean there wasn't harm to those farmers that had to abandon their rain-fed maize systems and change into something else, but it does provide evidence that for the maize system globally, we do see some adaptation, some mitigation of risk from how the geography of maize is changing. All right, so now I want to talk about the last component of that risk diagram, specifically reducing hazards. Again, we talked earlier about irrigation expansion being one mechanism for reducing hazards and specifically extreme temperatures. So on the left here, this is from some older work showing the trends in irrigated area by county across the country over the past almost century. And then on the right, we see basically how the extreme summer temperature trends are related to changes in irrigated area. And what we can see is those places that have the most increases in irrigated area have consistently negative um, uh, extreme temperature trends. And this is expected and has also been shown in a lot of modeling studies because increases in evapotranspiration from irrigation basically cool and moisten the local climate. Um, but another interesting point that we saw in this study is that actually there were some important nuances when looking at irrigated areas versus rain-fed areas. So first, I'm showing on the left here the trends in the extreme temperatures um, for areas with high irrigation growth. And then I've broken down those trends as into whether there was drought occurring or not drought occurring. And what you can see is that for irrigated areas, the drought doesn't have a big impact because they're supplying moisture from surface water supplies or groundwater pumping, and that we're not seeing a huge effect on the temperature trend. Um, but when you look at the rain-fed areas, a really interesting thing is that there's actually cooling in these very intensified rain-fed croplands that's of a comparable magnitude to the irrigated areas, as long as there's moisture. But then when there's drought conditions and that soil moisture is not present, then we see those extreme temperatures pop back up. And so, um, you know, in the US, we've seen a lot of warming in most places during most seasons, but one of our most productive um, agricultural areas is the central Midwest and kind of the Corn Belt. And that's an area where during the summer, we have not really seen very substantial warming. And in fact, depending on how you slice it, as we have here, we can actually see cooling, particularly in extreme temperatures. And so there are some competing explanations out there for this, but we certainly hypothesize that increased ET from these more productive croplands regardless of rain-fed versus irrigated are contributing to this warming hole. Um, so at the same time, we're worried about these hazards getting worse in the future, but we have this really important nuance of we've been super lucky in the central US so far. And there's a question of, just how long might that last? And so I don't have the results in here, but Danica Lombardozzi and I have a PhD student, Marion Shea, who's running some really interesting CESM simulations where we look at where we don't do anything but tweak the physiological characteristics of the crops, and we can see some of these impacts. All right. So I'm going to keep going on irrigation for just a little bit, and as I mentioned in the beginning, try and connect adaptation and mitigation. Um, so irrigation has all these benefits from increased productivity to reducing climate hazards, but it also has this kind of important climate feedback potential. So we know it's such a valuable climate adaptation tool that the concern is that we have warming, and then that leads to more irrigation, and that irrigation actually has some underappreciated greenhouse gas emissions associated with it, and then we could get more warming. So it's sort of a positive climate feedback through adaptation. And those greenhouse gas emissions from irrigation, as I said, have been underappreciated, and they originate, and part of the reason for that is that they originate from a lot of different mechanisms. And so we haven't really previously put all those pieces together to understand this. So um, one source is emissions from on-farm pumping, that energy use. We also see groundwater degassing. So some groundwater is actually super saturated in CO2, and when we pump it up and use it, we allow that water to equilibrate with the atmosphere and that CO2 to be released. Um, we also have increased nitrous oxide emissions from irrigation. And then we also have some interbasin transfers that use energy as well. So what we did in a couple of studies that came out last year is we looked at these different mechanisms um, and quantified them as best we could in the recent history. So for on-farm pumping, we actually used fuel expenditures and backed that out into amounts of fuel and used emissions factors to get those total emissions. Um, we used the USGS National Water Information System data set to get at groundwater degassing. And then for nitrous oxide, we partnered with Stephen Ogle's group and used the DayCent simulations that are used for the US National Greenhouse Gas Inventory. And we're able to basically create a meta model of those where we looked at the contribution of irrigation to N2O. And then for interbasin transfers, the student that led this, Avery Driscoll, did a really amazing, almost investigative journalism type study where, finding out, okay, who runs this water infrastructure, this water transfer, um, contacting them, getting their energy use. And it was kind of an exhaustive process of collecting all this information. So we worked with Landon Marston's group at Virginia Tech. They had this nice data set of the interbasin transfers, but then we had to go from there to get all of the energy use associated with them and attribute that to the relate that to the amount of water that was actually used for irrigation versus municipal supplies. Um, so one thing that we saw here was that on-farm pumping is really dominant, and it really matters, especially for groundwater, because it just takes so much more energy. And that's a good thing in a sense, because what we can do is try and electrify um, our pumping infrastructure. And there is a substantial amount of irrigation pumps that are already electrified. So we're going to see some decarbonization of that just with expected changes to the grid. So in the black line here, this is with our current policy in the Inflation Reduction Act, the decreases in emissions that we would expect. And then here in the gray line, this is if we additionally made an effort to electrify some of the natural gas and diesel and propane pumps out there. All right, so I want to kind of wrap up here, and so we can make sure to have a little time for questions, hopefully. So just some conclusions. We found in our work that it's really helpful to kind of think about system relevant hazards and sort of think broadly about how that could be different for different types of systems, rain-fed crops, irrigated crops, and dairy. And to use this climate risk framing to help us understand adaptation options and to look historically and try and find evidence for adaptation across different axes. So the vulnerability reduction for dairy, rain-fed crop migration, and as well as reductions in hazard from changes in irrigation and evapotranspiration. And then lastly, the importance when we're thinking about adaptation to think about trade-offs with adaptation for mitigation or other sustainability goals. And just a quick plug here, I'm serving as editor-in-chief for a new IOP publishing, relatively new journal, Environmental Research Food Systems. It's kind of a spin-off of Environmental Research Letters. And just a quick plug in to keep us in mind for any food systems related work. It's society-run and multidisciplinary and open access, and the APCs are currently waived. All right, so I'll stop there and open it up for questions.
Thank you, Dr. Mueller. Let's give him a round of applause. So yes, we'll open it up for questions. Yeah, online, feel free to raise your hand virtually, and in the room, feel free to raise your hand here. I can kick it off for you. Oh, go ahead, Leah.
Sure.
Hello, thanks for the great talk. Just so you know, I'm an applied economist, so a little bit outside of the area, but very interested in adaptation to climate change, and I work a lot in the agricultural sector. And so I'm wondering if you have done any work on saltwater intrusion risks exacerbated by climate change, and I'm thinking both about flooding and overland risks, but also through groundwater channels. So.
That's a great question. And I know Dr. Pinky Mondal at Delaware has done some relevant work on that. But yeah, it is something that we thought about just a little bit. In fact, I teach this data science class, and the last time I taught it, that was an issue that the class found really interesting. And so we kind of developed a framework to piece together the available data that's out there and try and look at not so much the groundwater and contamination issue, but more just like being inundated permanently or once per year or whatever, enough that it probably becomes not viable for agriculture. And so anyways, I think the students came up with a nice framework, and we implemented it in the most computationally efficient state that we could find with a lot of agriculture, which is Delaware. So it turns out it was kind of stressing their laptops to crunch the numbers beyond that. But I'm hopeful that we can pick it back up and actually publish that project, because it's really interesting. But basically the short answer is that I don't have a good sense of like the magnitude of how big of an issue it is. I think it's probably regionally important, but globally it's not quite as clear. But I do think that groundwater issue could definitely kind of exacerbate the scale of the impact.
Thank you.
I have a question, if I may. I'm Gabriela Mundaka. Yes, so I was wondering whether there is some work. I'm sure there is some work, but these adaptation measures, say just the irrigation, what are the costs of that for the farmers? Do you have any idea what is the cost of implementing of these adaptation policies? And of course now this issue on the how much they will be affected by the implementation of the Inflation Reduction Act.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think that connection with basically the economics of adaptation is still, I think there's still a lot of open space, if you will, there. A lot of questions that remain to be answered. As far as irrigation in particular, the finances of it are not something that we've looked at. However, I know Jonathan Winter at Dartmouth has a paper where they looked at basically how kind of that boundary between irrigated and unirrigated that goes through the Great Plains, like how that might shift in the future when they took into account kind of the costs of pumping and into the future, assuming changes in climate variability and maybe some drying in certain regions, trying to predict where it would make financial sense for farmers to adopt irrigation. And so they do see, you know, new areas showing as kind of crossing that threshold of more benefits than costs. But I do know irrigation is it's a massive investment for farmers. And so you do see some areas where there's mixed rain-fed and irrigated production, but yeah, it's really kind of depends on, it's very benefit dependent, right? Yeah. Good question.
Do you have any idea whether the farmers are very interested in implementing these adaptation policies? Or I mean, policies or measures? Do you have any, if they say, for example, if I get this, I can contribute with 30% if I get the rest.
Oh, I see. Kind of like incentivizing it. Yeah, that's a good question. I haven't, yeah, I don't know if I've have any good examples of policies explicitly formulated in that way, but I will say I have seen there's plenty of evidence that farmers are adapting, right? So in the case of the dairy study, we see these reductions in sensitivity to extremes, and we are reanalyzing some historical USDA surveys by climate zones, and we can see how you know, like hot areas have steadily adopted more shading structures and misters and those sorts of things. And I think they're just I'm not aware of any particular incentives for that, just that at some point they must have realized it was in their financial interest to do so. And then when it comes to irrigation, you know, anecdotally, I know there's, for example, in Minnesota, there's a lot more irrigation than there ever used to be before. And people are just finding that for whatever reason, changes in climate, but also maybe changes in crop prices and productivity, now all of a sudden it's become worth it for them to install irrigation, even if they're not using it every year, it just for the dry years.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Okay, yeah.
Hi, listen, thank you for your talk. It's really interesting. I have a general question. So, you mentioned that through irrigation, cooling, it can help reduce the weather hazards. So for the system you are studying, but what about the case because of the increase of irrigation? It can also lead to the risk of groundwater depletion. Is that a way of transfer the risk or somehow risk propagation? Can you share your comments or insights to that?
Yeah, absolutely. And that I think it's this idea of what are the trade-offs with adaptation. So it's clearly a great strategy for reducing heat-related risks and drought-related risks, right? As long as you have the water supplies. But there are trade-offs, and we've looked at the trade-offs with mitigation. But yeah, huge trade-offs with the sustainability of water use in different regions. I mean, in Colorado, I don't, you know, a lot of the water that originates in Colorado ends up leaving the state because of various, you know, interstate compacts and so on. But of the water that we use here, I mean, the vast majority of it goes for agriculture. I think like 80 or 90%, you know. So there's all this kind of like caricature of, you know, green lawns trying out the West or whatever, but mostly it's hamburgers, right? You know, we produce these crops and then we feed a lot of them to animals, and that's inefficient, and then we eat our hamburgers. So, you know, that's just the reality of, you know, where a lot of these where a lot of that water is going. And so that's an issue for sustainability of water supplies, whether it's surface water or groundwater. And definitely there are areas where groundwater is drying up and people are having to change their production, like in the Ogallala region. You know, there are some good case studies that not that I've worked on, but that I've seen where farmers have have kind of banded together and collectively altered their management to help stabilize their groundwater. But in other cases, you see people having to switch out of their preferred crops to either lower water use crops or to shift entirely away from irrigated ag to grazing or dryland production. But depending on where you are, that dryland production may not be like super viable. But yeah, great question. So yeah, I think in general, just these like adaptation, sustainability trade-offs are really important. Adaptation is clearly an important goal, but you know, we have to understand how it intersects with our other sustainability goals too.
I had one question. I was wondering if you or others that you work with, I mean, you talked about climate risks for crop production, you talked about climate risks for livestock, and so are you looking at all at like how climate risk for crop production gets passed through as a risk for feed-fed livestock?
That's a great question. Yeah, we haven't really done that. Kind of the supply chain connection of it yet, but I think it's a really important component to think about, because certainly as the price for feed fluctuates, then that does affect the livestock production system in general as well. We've been more looking at basically the simultaneous, the sort of the direct effect of the weather on the animals. Yeah, but there is this indirect effect of like, not only might you be affecting the total feed production and then the prices of the feed, but you also, in some cases, could be affecting like the forage quality for grazed animals and some things like that. So when we analyze the you know, when we analyze historical milk yields at the monthly level, you know, in talking with animal scientists, it seems like mostly what we're seeing is the direct effect on the cow, and that jives with how it's the sensitivity has diminished over time with the adoption of these different management practices. But we can't rule out that some of what we see too is also due to declines in forage quality with those kind of weather conditions as well.
Thank you. All right. Yeah, go ahead.
I can follow up with a really technical question. So in one of your slides, you mentioned that you see the THI have different impacts on the milk production for different regions, the cold region and the hot states, so hot states and cold states. I wonder actually how you define these different states and how that actually affect your results.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so for that graph, we just did a very simple separation of like, we put half of the milk production in the cold states and half of the milk production in the warm states, or something like that. But then what we did after that, yeah, and so of course there, depending on how you draw that line, you can see some slight shifts in those characterizations. But to get away from that kind of arbitrary definition, what we then did was we incorporated mean climate conditions, so basically mean THI in each state, as a kind of a continuous interaction term with our THI sensitivity, so that the sensitivity to THI actually is allowed to vary based on the mean climate of each state, and that helped us capture kind of the fact that this is a continuous kind of response. So yeah, we're really hot states versus moderately hot states versus slightly cool states versus really cold states. Yeah, great question.
Any other questions from the room or online? All right, let's give Dr. Mueller another round of applause.
Thanks
So
for having
I
me.
think we'll have seminar again. It's in person.
Yes, it's in person.
in person in Pearson 218. Thank you to everybody for joining.
From Gabrielle. Okay, so, Lisa and I, we're going to have a meeting at 2:00, maybe.
Okay. Yep.
Cool.
So yeah, maybe I'll hop
Yeah,
off and then I'll join again in a few minutes. Does that sound
That'd be
okay?
great. Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you.
Okay, perfect.
Cool.
Okay.
See you. Yeah.
All right. Yeah.
Thanks, Nathan.